Okay, so you know so much now about how legislation is passed, how regulations and rules are created and enforced, and they're pretty intense, complex processes, but there is a path, right? And we've passed lots of laws, we've passed lots of rules, but as you go through some of the deep dives, we're going to really notice where there are no laws and there are no rules or regulations when there should be, right? Sometimes we don't have laws on a certain area for a certain reason, right? We don't want to inhibit innovation, for example. So maybe we just leave everything a little unregulated and let the industry congeal before we start saying what they should and shouldn't do. But you're going to see and you're going to hear that we're actually at a point in the technology, we need some rules and regulations. We need some leadership. We need to be pointed in the right direction. We need some safety measures, for example. And you're going to find that those laws and rules and regulations don't exist. And you're going to hear that bills have been introduced, but they never made it out of committee. Or rules were written, but they were struck down. Or rules haven't been written, or they got held up in the notice of proposed rulemaking. You're going to hear about problems that we have encountered in passing various types of regulations and legislation. And so let's talk a little bit about why that may be, what's going on. And so, this is politics at the end of the day. We have two major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and the control of Congress is constantly in flux, right? If you have one party controlling both chambers, you have a little bit of an easier time. When I say controlling, meaning they have the majority of Congress people in the House and in the Senate. When that happens, it's much easier to pass legislation because you have a majority. You can get through all those hurdles. But what's harder is with one chamber is one party and another chamber is another party. That makes it a little bit more difficult. And so the influence of political parties can really slow down legislation and agendas. The president can also be incredibly influential. So whichever party the president is part of, and which parties have, how that matches up with the parties that are in control of the chambers of Congress, really matters. And the president has priorities, and while Congress does not have to follow those president's priorities, they often do for political reasons. And so if, for example, automated vehicles are not on the president's agenda, we might not see a lot of action in that space, right? Lobbying is a huge part of the political process. So if you're not familiar with lobbying, lobbyists are people or organizations who, they can be industry groups or nonprofits or just other stakeholders who lobby Congress and federal agencies to influence legislation and rulemaking. So they want to persuade, when I say lobby, they want to persuade lawmakers to support or oppose specific regulations, specific legislation, specific policies. And so sometimes this looks just like educating the politician, right? Maybe it's a group of tech CEOs, for example, who want to explain why a certain regulation would really halt innovation. Or maybe it's a group of concerned citizens who speak on behalf of people who are hurt by a type of technology and who want to tell their personal stories and say, this is why this needs to be regulated. And maybe it's the industry that just wants to protect their profit and their bottom line. But lobbyists come in all different shapes and forms, and they can have a very large influence on what legislation gets written and introduced, how it's written, and whether it ultimately passes or not. They also play a role in regulation, because they are the ones that may provide comments during the public comment period, and they're the ones that also may challenge those rules in court later on. So lobbying groups and interest groups play a very large role in U.S. Politics and legislation and rulemaking. Public opinion and media, right? These are politicians. They are elected. They're not hired. Agency workers are usually hired. They're employees, right? But politicians are elected. And if their constituents aren't happy with them, they're going to lose their job. So public opinion in general, but a public opinion of constituents can really shape the legislative agenda, especially on high-profile issues like healthcare, for example. And then also media coverage will influence how legislation and regulation are perceived by the public, and they often can pressure lawmakers to act or adjust their policies. Congress itself can hold a lot of control over the rulemaking process, even though the rulemaking process is part of the executive branch, right? The agencies are typically under the executive branch or they're independent. Congress can hold oversight hearings, right? So they can always, subpoena someone to come testify before them. And if they don't like the rules that an agency is passing, even if they're not in control of that agency, the president is, they can, turn up the heat. They can grill the heads of those agencies, the secretaries of the departments, can be brought down to Congress and grilled in a very public manner and have a lot of pressure put on them if Congress doesn't like the way that rulemaking is going or regulation is going. Congress also controls the purse. They control the money. And so they control the budget of federal agencies, and that gives them significant leverage over rulemaking. So if I don't like the rules you're passing, I'll cut your budget. You won't exist. And so the president and the executive branch, as you've heard, is directly, these agencies are under the authority of the executive, but the legislative branch in Congress still can hold a lot of sway over them. And then finally, the judiciary has a role to play. The federal courts play a crucial role in interpreting and reviewing the statutes and regulations like we just saw, and the political leanings of justices and judges shaped by presidential appointments can really influence the interpretation of laws and regulations. We just talked about that with the Chevron deference, which has been around for a long time, getting overturned. And the judiciary saying, this is our job to interpret, not the executive branch's job to interpret. So we will take over from here. Thank you. That's a political leaning of those judges and justices. And so the judiciary can play, even though it's not the judiciary's role to pass legislation or pass rulemaking, they have the power to invalidate legislation. They have the power to invalidate rules and regulations that are passed. And so they remain important as well. And this is the way the system was designed, right? It's checks and balances. No one branch has complete and total authority. The other branches have a say-so and can check them. So it's the way it was meant to be, but it also can slow things down considerably. And so when we get to, for example, discussing artificial intelligence or privacy or regulation of automated vehicles, we're missing some real key pieces of legislation, and we're seeing a lot of rules that already exist that are not being updated. And it's for some of these reasons that you see here. And sometimes it's also just the process takes a while. And so hopefully when you run into these issues where we're really lacking legislation or regulation and it's actually hurting the industry, you'll have a good understanding of maybe why that is.